You're listening to Art Affairs, episode 81. Today I'll be talking to Jolene Lai. Alright, so my name is Michael Faith, and this is Art Affairs. Art Affairs is my attempt at shining a spotlight on the many wonderful people that make up this amazing art community, featuring conversations with artists, gallerists, curators, telling their stories. You can dig through previous episodes, complete with show notes, at artaffairs.podcast.com, but the best way to stay plugged in is to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're really enjoying the show and want to help support what I'm doing here in an even bigger way, check out the Art Affairs Patreon. Not only does it give you an opportunity to help keep the show going, but there are several community-oriented benefits as well, like getting early access to episodes and suggesting questions for upcoming guests. You can find all the information about that at patreon.com/artaffairs. You can also connect with the show on Instagram at Art Affairs Podcast. All right, so today's guest is artist Jolene Lai. Jolene paints whimsical, but also very mysterious and haunting paintings, rich in story and narrative. But she didn't move into her painting career immediately. She actually started with graphic design. We talk about this early graphic design work she did at the start of her career, how she ultimately moved into her fine art practice, her new solo show at ThinkSpace, and a whole lot more. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jolene Lai. Jolene, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you on.
Thanks for inviting me. This is actually pretty terrifying.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully by the end you'll think it actually turned out pretty well. I think it will be great.
Okay.
So let's dive into your background a little bit. And I know that you were born and grew up and spent a significant part of your life in Singapore. But what part of Singapore did you grow up in? Like, what was that area like when you were growing up?
I guess Singapore is really, really small. So to me, almost all the neighborhoods kind of feel the same to me. So a lot of buildings in Singapore are pretty much like high-rise buildings. So to live in like a big house that's, like a, what do you call it? Like a house of 2 stories or like a garden in the backyard. Like you got to be really, really rich. So I didn't grow up like that. I grew up in high-rise buildings, lived in tiny apartments, was the only child. So that's how my life was.
So like super urban, it sounds like.
Yeah. Singapore is pretty urban. It's
Okay.
like almost like a city, a country within itself. When people ask me, where is Singapore and what is Singapore? I would say like, it's on the equator. We're like a dot on a globe, like a really, really tiny dot. That's about it.
Yeah. And I found that interesting, just reading a little bit more. It's a city that is its own country. But I mean, I guess it doesn't sound like you really had an opportunity to spend much time in nature at all. Is there opportunities for that in Singapore? Maybe
like parks. I have to say the parks in Singapore are pretty well built. It's like koi ponds, beautiful, lush gardens. So we're not lack of man-made recreation in that sense. But when I grew up as a kid, the shopping malls were just starting in the neighborhoods. So when I was really young, if you needed to go to big shopping malls, you got to go downtown, which we call Orchard Road, which still exists today. But then as I said, started growing up, we started having more shopping malls built within each little neighborhoods. And that's kind of how Singapore has progressed. They kind of allow you to not need to go down to downtown. So it's just a few steps away from a shopping mall.
Nice.
So nobody really drives in Singapore. I mean, people still drive and they still own a car, but you can basically get anywhere on buses, trains, cabs. So I don't have a license. I can't drive. I'm in the United States. People think it's pretty crazy. I think it's pretty crazy, but
Well, especially in LA, like there are some walkable cities in the US, but not many, and especially not LA.
yeah. So yeah, I get a lot of like people questioning like, why don't you learn how to drive? And it's a very good question. I think I'm just terrified. I'm just terrified of driving, which I know sounds absurd, but that's how it is.
No, I get it. I mean, especially with the kind of traffic that you guys get over there. It's crazy. What kind of work did your parents do? Anything on the creative side?
Well, my mom, when I was a kid, my dad was a welder, so he did some welding. My mom was working at some factories. And then when I grew up a little bit more, they started doing some little small like business in the market. So they sold a lot of what would you call that? Ingredients. Like you can get things like fish ball, cuttlefish, raw materials like tofu. That's what they would sell in a little small market that we call a dry market. We call it, there's a difference. So you get a big wet market. So if you go there, it's like the floor is always wet. It's a little bit fishy. You get the butcher, you get the fishmonger, you get the vegetable seller, and they're all concentrated in a very big open space. There's no AC. So it really, in Singapore, is like summer every day for the rest of the year. So it's really humid and hot. But people go there and we got to get our food, our groceries. And then you get the dry market, which is where my mom and dad set up their little stall. And it's smaller, it's mini. The floors are less wet. You still don't get AC. But within that little market that they set up their stall, we had the butcher. We had a fishmonger. We had my dad selling his stuff. And then you got the stall that's next to him selling things like bean sprouts. So they'll come like really fresh in the morning in a huge barrel. And I get to touch it when they open up the lid. It's like fresh and steaming. And then, yeah, later on when people start coming, the bean sprouts are all like cooled down. But I get a little image of what the market is like early in the morning. So that's what I kind of did.
Interesting. So, I mean, just thinking like an interesting transition from welding to like selling food products. Did you have much exposure to the arts as a kid? Was it something you felt like you were surrounded by in some way, or at least had some direct connection to?
Well, I think if I were to think about it, I think I got my creative drawing genes from my dad. And then the more like organic, like hands-on stuff from my mom, because my mom can't draw, but my dad is a lot better. I think the first person that I was really jealous when it came to like being creative was actually my dad. Because he decided that one time when I was a kid growing up, like, let's do something. And he just took out a folding table and put it along the corridor of our house and just laid like a big piece of white paper on top of the table. And he said, let's just sketch.
Nice.
Yeah. It's like, a dad that doesn't want to do any outdoor activities. Let's just do some drawing. So I ended up doing that, and he just started doodling with just a pen, a ballpoint pen, and I was doodling, and then I kind of peeped over on his side to see what he was doing, and I was just like flabbergasted at that age, because he started doing like some little doodles of the village that he grew up, coconut trees, and if I looked at it now, I'll be like, oh, okay, it's no big deal from where I am today. But it's like back then as a kid, it's like, how did you do that? Like, I got jealous and a little bit and like just angry, like, oh, I can't do that. And then from there, it just went like, every now and then I'll just grab a piece of big paper, put it on the floor and just doodle and sketch. And I wasn't too great at my other subjects. Art was something that was a little bit more natural to me, something that I was less afraid of. But I think I don't know about today, but back then in the Asian culture, like, it's not something your parents want you to excel in. You want to be better in things like, I don't know, math, English, just be better at anything but art. Art is like the last subject they care about. So my dad would prefer me to, just concentrate on other things than art.
Mm. So did they discourage you from kind of leaning into that side of your schooling?
A little bit, yeah. Like spend less time on art and spend more time on the other things, which I wasn't good at.
So did you want to be something else besides an artist? Did you have your sights set on some other profession? Like when somebody asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Was it something other than artist?
Yeah, it's like that question that you always get when you're a kid. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? So I think one of the things that I said was, a scientist, a zookeeper, an astronaut. And then one of the part of that list was an illustrator. So I think that was one thing that was really close to art that kind of came true, but not really there yet.
Were the other things just to please your parents? Like, were the other things you listed, or did you really want to be them genuinely?
I think I still love animals. I still go to zoos sometimes and say to myself, like, wouldn't be such a bad thing to volunteer at the zoo. So yeah, I still like it. But astronaut and scientist, no.
You can't volunteer to be an astronaut. That's a little harder to get into.
No, yeah, I don't qualify. Not anywhere near. Yeah.
When it came time to go to school, you ultimately went to art school. So how did you transition from, your parents were sort of discouraging you away from art, and you also kind of wanted to be a scientist in some degree. How did that change to the point where your parents were both accepting of you going to an art school, but also you ended up, kind of wanting to do that yourself?
Well, so when I was a kid and my parents knew that I liked drawing and knew that I could draw, my mom would, tell people like, oh, check out her drawing. Like, it's awesome. And I remembered I drew like it's like that generation where you grew up watching He-Man and She-Ra.
Sure. Yeah.
And it was that, that unicorn that she would ride on or something like that. And I drew it. It was in color. And my dad took that piece of drawing and he put up on the wall where his stall was. So every day when his customers come by, they get to look at it. So that was like the first time I felt like, wow, this is cool. Like somebody appreciates my art enough to put it on a wall and show his customers. Like I felt grand. And then it went on from going to school and majoring in art at when you have to choose between, they gave us some choices, like, do you want to major in accounting? This was in high school. Accounting, art, or you get to do home economics. Like, I don't want to cook. I'm bad at math, so I ended up with art. And it was fun because art classes was like a time where you just sat down, you work on your art while talking. You don't really get that in accounting. Like everybody's just flipping their calculators, and the home economic kids are having fun cooking. I love the home economic kids because after art, we get to go eat the food that they cook. Right. Yeah, but I didn't want to cook. So art class was fun until it became like, because you are an art student, anytime when there's like a school activity or a festival and they require you to do things like design a poster for the event, immediately they look at you and you're like, you're an art student. You're a little bit of a pushover, so you get to draw the tickets for this event. And it kind of went down that avenue of like, if you are art student, you get to be assigned with these kind of tasks. And I felt like, well, there were other things that I was interested in that I never get a chance to do. Music, or, you just get labeled and categorized, and I felt like annoyed. And then I also developed this anxiety. I'm slow when I do my art, when I'm doing my craft, and I always get to stay behind when everybody goes home. Or I get to come back on weekends, and I was the only person in class doing that with the teacher staring at me, and I started feeling this anxiety and stress. from art, and I started to develop this dislike for art. And then I went from high school to college.
And you went to LaSalle initially, right, in Singapore?
It was actually another place where it was an institute that prepared you for 3 years before you go to the university.
Okay.
It wasn't a very good school, but it was the only thing I qualified for because my grades for other things except art was just atrocious. So I ended up in that college. I met a lot of great people there, but it happened in a way, it went in such a way that I became the only student in art class. There was at first maybe 3 students, and then they kind of left the school and went somewhere else after year 1. So I was the only student in that class.
Wow.
And that was great because you have all the attention, but terrifying because when the principal has this whole school meeting and she starts talking about statistics of final year grades, like, oh, probably this year we're going to have 70% of passes for math. And then when she got to art, she's like, we either have 100% fail or 100% pass. And then everybody
it's one person.
yeah, everybody just turns around and looks at you. I'm like, oh, just sinking in my seat.
Oh.
And the teacher was great. She taught me some things in art that I never learned from high school, which I think still resonates in me when I do my art. The only not so great part was that she really enjoyed talking about, I don't know, gossips, school life. And I think at that point, I just wanted to come to class and just learn. I was really bad at talking, which is why this podcast is so terrifying. So yeah, I enjoyed going to class, but at the same time, I dreaded talking. But whatever she taught me, I thought that they were really great skills that I learned from, the way she would tell me to paint an apple. She wouldn't say paint what you see. She would tell me, break it down into pieces. So if for the people who are, familiar with software like AutoCAD, you start to see that whole wireframe before you put on the skin and everything. So she taught me to see things in wireframe, which is why when I start out doing my work, they almost feel like they're in shapes and pieces, pixelation, like that.
Yeah, interesting. And so your focus while you were there, before you ended up going to UCLA, was painting. So what were you hoping to, what was your career goal at that point? You moved on from wanting to be a zoologist or a scientist, and now you were like, okay, I want to be an artist. But what did you imagine that your career would be as you were focusing on painting?
I think I took painting actually when I was in Singapore, in LaSalle, like you mentioned. So LaSalle came before UCLA extension in the United States. And so to be really brief, painting in LaSalle took me an extra 3 years. To continue the story from college, it was 3 years. And a month before I graduated, I quit.
Oh, wow.
So my dad was just like,
oh my God.
He almost fell off his chair. Everybody, I think the whole school was flabbergasted. My principal was...
So the one student went to 0.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think I basically announced I don't want to continue this. I know it's a month or 2. I can't remember, but it was a very short period. And I think everybody was just telling me don't worry. Just go take your exams, even though you are not going to study for it. Just take it anyway. And I think in my mind, I felt like, well, I know I didn't study. I'm not going to do good at it. Why should I do it anyways? I think I was a little bit of a rebel that way. And I think after almost 3 years of art at that college, it came to a point where I just really felt like I hated art. Like art gave me so much stress that I would be building on my final art. We're supposed to do this project and submit it for the final Like you have to submit this grand project at the end of 3 years for art. And I had been working on it for a year or so, and it was working with wires and I was banging with hammers, and I got to a point where I just was like hammering and throwing my hammer at my project and just felt like, yeah, I think I'm almost at that cliff about to fall, and I said I can't do it anymore. So I quit school. I got called into the principal's office and I explained to her I can't do this anymore, and her reply was something like, you'll get over it. You're gonna find a new boyfriend. And she took it like I was, quitting school because of some boy-girl relationship. And it was totally not that way. Yeah. So it was crazy. I left. And when I finally wanted to go to LaSalle, it was, I think, after 1 or 2 years. And it was not because I wanted to do art, but I think at that point of my life, I was also getting into a situation where I felt like I needed to get out, and the only way was to have focus. Just focus your mind on something. And a friend told me, like, why don't you go to LaSalle? Why don't you work on something that you know you're good at? Just try it. I see what you do. They're great. So try it out. And that's how I got to LaSalle. I didn't want to do painting. I wanted to do interior design because a part of me felt like I liked it enough, and the other side told me, like, you're gonna get a better salary as an interior designer versus a painter, and maybe your dad would be more supportive. So I went in, I had an interview, and then the teacher there told me, you're a painter, you're not an interior designer. So at the very beginning, I was just shocked that somebody would tell me that. But I went through the first year of foundation. You're exposed to all the different things like design, sculpture, interior design, painting. I took it all. I hated interior design, and I ended up in painting.
So how did you overcome that anxiety, though? Because like it seemed like you had a lot of bad experience at the the college that you were in that was giving you anxiety to the point where you didn't even want to do art anymore. So how did you overcome that to then focus again on art at LaSalle?
It's really interesting when you start to be a part of a pool of people who love art, who are good at art. You start to feel like there's some kind of challenge there. Like, oh, this person is pretty good. Can I be better? Can I excel? And I think the challenge that I saw at LaSalle from my peers started to make me feel a different way about art. I started enjoying the challenges that it gave me. And even though some projects really require you to not sleep. So that you'll be like working and working and you're not sleeping and you're just getting used to feeling high every day from not sleeping. And it was enjoyable because everybody was going through that. You weren't alone. It didn't feel like I was the only one left in the classroom doing a project with a teacher staring at me. I didn't have to have a conversation about entertainment gossips with a teacher. Yeah, it was just being in a mix of people who truly loved art and not understanding that how some of them could see art in a way that I couldn't. And I think that was really interesting. And then it started to make me enjoy art. And I still feel the stress sometimes. And the stress comes from not painting fast enough. It's a different kind of stress that I feel. It's not the same, yeah.
So how did you ultimately shift then to UCLA and then focus on graphic design?
So one day in Singapore, I went clubbing and I met this guy. And this guy he told me, he's from the United States. He's just arrived in Singapore. We had a dance. He tried to buy me a drink. I said no. And I was working at a gallery at that point of time. And he said, why don't I come give you a visit the next day? And I said, sure. But what are the chances? Somebody visiting Singapore on a business trip would come find me at the gallery? Absolutely not. But he did. Right at the minute when I was about to closed doors at the gallery. I didn't think, from morning till night, I waited. And at about 5 minutes before I was closing shop, he appeared.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, okay. Maybe there's something interesting about this guy. And then it just kind of went from long distance call to him saying, why don't you come to LA? So I visited, and then I came back to Singapore. And then we talked some more, and then we decided that I should come to LA. And the only way for me to stay in LA for a longer period of time was to get a visa. And that's how I kind of got into UCLA Extension. And I know I didn't want to do painting anymore. I just didn't want to. I wanted to do something different. So I ended up taking design instead, which was a different kind of stress too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, talk about the speed of delivery. There's a lot of deadlines involved with graphic design, right?
I think graphic design, going into it with no concept, there were really basic terms of I took this class called media literacy. That was really terrifying for me. I never want to do it again. It was about the rollover on mouse and the UI, things like that, which I'm not familiar with because you don't think about things like that when you go on the internet. So that part was really challenging. But then after a while, when you start to understand the lingo, you get a little bit better.
So between the two programs, painting in the school at Singapore and then graphic design at UCLA, which do you feel in retrospect connected with you more?
I think painting more, but the design part of it, I think sometimes when I paint, it's I use the word rigid, very straight, very tight, which I feel maybe because of all the really clean lines in design, I feel a part of my character is like that. But painting, on the other hand, I like to be organic and loose. And I try to be, but I can't really do it. I'm still struggling with it sometimes. So, yeah.
So it's almost a blending of the two, or characteristics of the two practices that you've kind of merged together.
Yeah, because I think when I started painting, blending was not something that was easy to me. I know a lot of people just go with their brushes and just blend. I couldn't. It was a hard thing to do. So when I touch acrylic, it's like death. Because acrylic just dries up so fast, and I struggle with blending it fast enough for it to not dry up. So that is still challenging to me until I touched oil, and it's like, oh, I can be slow and just take my time and blend it. But like I said, the teacher in college taught me to break down things in shapes, which is what I feel sometimes a little bit like design, where everything is shapes, pixels. So there's a part of me that's very geometric, and then kind of going into something that's trying to be organic.
Sure. So after finishing school, did you not move back to Singapore at any point?
I did not.
Okay.
After design, I looked for a job. I got into a job. It was a design company that focused a lot on entertainment movie posters. So that was a great company.
Is that the Refinery Creative? Is that? Okay.
They still exist, I believe. For anybody that could go work for them, if you're a designer who wants to do something with entertainment and you're in LA, definitely go check them out. I felt like I learned a lot from the people there. We got to work with a lot of, things like Avatar, Mad Men. So I got to see a little bit of how a regular movie poster is built. And yeah, it opened my mind to how you would prep something before you go in and you actually execute it.
Sure. What was your responsibilities while you were working there? What kind of stuff did you usually work on?
So I started with production. basically building up specs for them. And so, the designer has no time to work on dimensions that the company wants, the client wants. So we'll build up the specs in Photoshop for them. So they have this what do you call it? Like a template. So we'll build templates and then they would design it, and then the client would approve of whichever comp they like. And then from there, you got to work with different dimensions. So if you decided on design A, then you got to kind of have like what size for billboard, what size for movie posters. And then we'll come in and kind of fit the final piece into different dimensions. So that was kind of my job. And then it went from there to having a mentor teach you how to design stuff. So we did some logos. I didn't stay on too long because I got news from back in Singapore that my dad was sick. So then I had to kind of quit and basically go back because my job couldn't wait for me.
You mentioned learning a lot while you were working there. What are some of the lessons that you feel that you learned in the graphic design work that you did that you feel maybe you applied later in your painting practice?
One of the very simple things was labeling your JPEGs. Yeah, because everything was very neat and organized. You have to label it in a systematic way so that, people can find the files. Everybody's sharing something. So that was one thing, like learn to be neat and organized. And then learning how to rebuild something that somebody built. So it's almost like somebody gave you a fully built, completed jigsaw puzzle. Now you kind of need to dismantle it and rebuild it into a different shape or dimension. And that's hard because you got to keep it kind of similar, but obviously it's going to change. So I had to do that. And then actually being really fast because I'm a slow person. So in the design world, everybody needs things like on time. So that was stressful. Yeah, it felt to me like working at Wall Street sometimes. I was the only one running up and down for no reason. That was, I think, what one of my coworkers felt, probably.
Right on. So while you were working there, were you also able to dedicate any time to painting? Like, is it something you were even exploring on the side at all while you were doing your graphic design job?
Yeah. Sometimes while working, I have like a little side screen chatting with somebody in Singapore. I don't think I'm supposed to do that, but whatever, I left. So I have this friend, his name is Ayman. He's somebody I went to LaSalle with. He was still painting. He graduated, he painted, and then he was showing in galleries. So I was chatting with him, talking about how, how's your life, how's my life? And he told me he's painting. And I think when he told me that, I felt pinched. A part of me just felt like, oh, I should be doing that. Why am I not doing it? But there was at the same time the glory of working at a design firm. So when you get things, Thanksgiving holidays and people sit down and they ask you about your work, you can tell them, oh yeah, I'm working on Mad Men. Last week we were talking about Avatar and Warner Brothers, oh, interesting, glorious stories, things to be proud about. But then a part of me just felt like I want to paint. I miss painting. And feeling like that I couldn't until I think when I did have to kind of travel to and fro from Singapore and LA because of my dad, I think I finally had that a little bit of freedom to just say, okay, I don't have the time to do something at a company. What can I do then? So that's kind of how I went back to painting.
Okay. Interesting. So, and I know that, you ultimately dove into that kind of full force. Did you then spend all of your time at painting, or were you still trying to do side jobs just to kind of pay the bills at the time?
I was lucky because my better half was working.
Okay.
So that part of my life, I think, is truly blessed to have somebody willing to support you. I think that's not easy to come across. So I kind of just took the time and just went all into painting.
Nice.
And I think the beginning was hard because, yeah, you can paint, but what does it mean? You can paint and put the paintings in your room, or you can try to find something and, somewhere to display them, but who's going to take it? And I think that road of trying to discover something was challenging at the beginning.
Yeah, and so you ultimately started, showing in group shows around 2011, and then a solo the year after. How did you, overcome that barrier, that difficulty of getting, finding a place to show your work and start making some of those relationships in the gallery world?
Well, I started with very small things like, can I find some cafes? Because I think at that era of time, people were like doing cafe art, like displaying your works in coffee shops and just trying to get an audience. And I think I first looked into that. I didn't find anything that I wanted to display it at. And then I found a gallery. I can't remember. I think it was in Arcadia, maybe. I can't remember. Just a small gallery that took me in. It was a group show. I started there. And then one day, I heard Esau was doing a show. And when I was in LaSalle in Singapore, I heard about Esau. I think it was through magazines. I flipped through them in the library, and we didn't have a lot of resources then. And internet was big at that time, but it wasn't that big where I was. I don't know. My circle was small. I didn't get a lot of chance to be exposed to a lot of resources. And when I saw Esau's work, I was just like, wow. And then I looked at his website, and back then it was his older website, and it had a little, it was like animated.
Yeah, with Flash.
Yes.
Because you did a lot of Flash work back in the day.
Right. So it was like this little girl that would like lift up her skirt, and then it had like photo frames of artwork, and if you roll over, mouse over, you'd see the thing like moving. I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And here's a little joke. For so many years when I was in LaSalle, I thought Esau was a girl. Because I didn't know, like, my culture was so tiny. I wasn't exposed to, like, the West culture too much. So the name Esau felt like a name I've never heard of. So in my mind, it sounded like it's a girl. And then maybe I was just, like, visually influenced by this website with this little girl pulling up a skirt. And it just, like, got stuck in my head that this is a female artist. So when I heard Esau was gonna have his show in LA, and I don't think he lived in LA at that time, it was New York. I thought, wow, I'm gonna go check out his work, because for so many years, I've only seen them on paper. And I think his show was at ThinkSpace, and that's how I went to ThinkSpace and I saw his work. I think he was there, and I realized to my horror that he's not a girl. He's a male painter. I'm sorry, Esau, if you're listening to this. Yeah, I was like really, it took me by surprise, but I got to see his works up close and personal, and it was really, I love his works. They're magical.
Yeah.
And then I got to ThinkSpace, and I checked out the gallery space. I checked out the works that they were displaying, and I really liked it. I liked the way they were featuring art. I liked the way that they were being professional. It wasn't a lot of that kind of aspect I see in a lot of galleries sometimes. Like, sometimes you walk into a gallery and it's just like very dead. And the works that they're displaying is like so fine, or trying to be in some kind of, I call it the frou-frou, vibe. And I just feel like, okay, I don't really like it. But
pretentious, I think, is what.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Try not to use that, but yeah. ThinkSpace just came across friendly. It was warm. The works that they were showing was always fun and exciting. It was going in and always seeing different artists at different shows showing things that just excited me, which I didn't get from the pretentious galleries that I go to. And then I think one day I just decided, checking out their website, they have this like critique session. So I thought maybe I'll give it a try. And I was scared because I have never done anything like that in LA. And I was terrified of talking to people. But I did it, and I went, and that was the first time I met Elsie from ThinkSpace. And he gave me a critique session. I was terrified the whole time. I think maybe half of what he said just didn't register in. But the only thing he told me was like, oh, you know what? If you look at a piece of work and it doesn't catch you within 3 minutes, it's done deal. Like, this work is not going to work. So that phrase from him always, I still remember it from today. And then from there, he gave me a chance to participate in the Cannibal show. It was like a pop-up show for like, I can't remember, maybe one night, and I did it. And I think that piece sold. And then that was kind of how I got an opportunity to kind of further and go directly into ThinkSpace and do like group shows with them. And that's
awesome.
Yeah, how it started.
That's fantastic. And so, like, had after that first show, seeing Esau's work in a gallery setting, did you become more active in the local art community? Like, were you going to shows regularly?
Yeah, more. And if anybody knows me in Singapore, I don't do that. I don't really like going to art shows. So when I was in LaSalle, they would often do like, let's go to the museum, let's go to this show. And I would always not go. And one day my friend played a trick. He called me on my phone and pretended to be my lecturer. And my lecturer has this like really distinct voice. And he was a scary figure in school. Like, I would never be late for his class, and I just always try, just always try to be on the good side, because he was scary to me. And my friend called, pretended to be my lecturer. I bought it, and he said, why aren't you at the museum right now? Why did you skip it? And I was like, oh, well. And then he burst out laughing. So yeah, when I came to LA and I discovered ThinkSpace and some of the other galleries around that were showing artists that I've never seen such works from, I started liking them. And then I started going to more shows and identifying more artists that I enjoyed their work. And then gradually you kind of see the work, and without looking at who painted it, oh, that's the artist that I like. Yeah.
And so has it been, after establishing this relationship, initially with LC and then with ThinkSpace, has it been important to you to have that kind of solid gallery partnership or relationship? Has that been an important component to your career?
I think so, because I think without them, I wouldn't even be close to where I am today. I feel like they treat every artist nice, fair, like a family. So I think without their help, if I never went to ThinkSpace and never got a chance to do any of the shows, I don't feel like I would be where I am today.
Awesome. So let's shift a little bit and talk about the themes of the work that you create. It was hard to put a pinpoint on exactly how they strike me, but I think I could describe it as a bit whimsical, but also with like a strong sense of mystery and like a twinge of darkness and like somberness mixed in, almost
right.
Like there's sort of this underlying, like almost like it's in the periphery. Like there's some darkness in the periphery waiting for you, but it's kind of off screen.
You're right.
And so I guess, is that the type of vibe? So that's how it strikes me. So is that what you're like aiming for? Is that ultimately what you're trying to achieve? Is this kind of coexistence of dark and light, or mystery and whimsy?
So I think when I first started in art school at LaSalle, I didn't do paintings like that. I actually did a lot of so-called abstract art. So I would go around the neighborhood, and what would really fascinate me was textures. So I would go around with my camera and just do close-up of textures. So it would be rust on metal, or like the texture of like trunks on trees. And I would paint that. And that was what I kind of did for my final year project. And when I graduated after that, I had visited an island. It was a broken down house. Nobody lived in it. Everything was kind of shattered. I went and I took a photo and I just decided to paint it. And I wanted to put like a little character in it, and I ended up putting a woman in it. And it was just like a house with like a roof that's almost half broken. The light was shining in, and you have this woman in red just in that midst of the light. And I think that painting kind of made me feel like, oh, I don't have to always paint abstract art all the time. And just moving from like really zoom in view to something just, bigger. And then really allowing myself to think about, so if you want to put something in it, what's the story? And I finished that girl painting, but then I also went back to abstract art. And I brought in some other characters like frogs for the fun of it. And then tried to put in some like whimsical story, like what is the frog doing? And I think there was this painting that had just like a very abstract background and this little frog. And it was just standing right next to a Wonder Woman keychain, same size. Yeah. So I was like, oh, okay, this is pretty funny. Like it tickled myself. And I think it just went from weird, quirky stuff like frogs to like actual people. And then I got offered a chance to do a collaborative exhibition with Ayman, my friend that I was chatting at the design company. Yeah. So he said, oh, you want to get back to painting? Why don't we do a group show together? So I think he was actually the first person that gave me a chance, so to speak, to go back to painting, which I'm always today very grateful for, because he said, don't worry about the logistics part of it. Like, I'll get in touch with the gallery. You just take your time to paint. And when you're done, you come back to Singapore and we'll do a show together. So I did that. And that painting highlighted a lot of like urban buildings and lots of girls that I put in, each with a different story. That was my first show, officially in Singapore. Then from there, I was offered another chance to do another show, a solo with a gallery in Singapore. And at that point, I was really interested in the Asian culture of like the supernatural part of it. Because I grew up kind of half Buddhist and half Christian. My dad was pretty Buddhist. Like he would say, learn how to chant this scripture. And I'll do it because he's my dad. Like, don't you question your dad. Like, don't do that. So I would do that. And then when I grew up a little bit older, I have my other side of my family who's more Christian. They're like, let's go to church. So I always have this like mix of like Buddhism and Christianity combined. And I would always do what people tell me to do. I didn't really question much when I was a kid. And when I grew up a lot more, I started questioning all the Asian beliefs that was told to me, the myths, the folklore, and I started reading into it and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. How can I portray each of these stories onto my painting? And that was how that solo in Singapore kind of came about.
Okay. And so is that, I guess, when you sort of embraced the storyteller within you? Because, before you were doing more abstract work, but it sounded like, even in those early stages, you were already kind of developing a storytelling, kind of the storyteller within you and expressing that with the frog and the Wonder Woman. And do you feel that comes natural to you? Like you have this story inside of you that you want to tell and you can't help but tell it?
Sometimes, and sometimes it's also a story that you grew up experiencing, right? Like I told you, my dad had a stall at a dry market. So when he started business, I would tag along and it's early in the morning, like 5, 6 a.m. And you get the first look at what goes on behind the scenes before, all the people come and they shop for their groceries. And I would see the butcher get their whole pig uncut up. It was like a whole pig, 2 pigs, and they'll, just be lying on the butcher's table. And then I'll start seeing the butcher come and start separating each different parts. And that was fascinating to me because I've only seen pieces of the meat at the supermarket, but I don't know how they chop it up. So I get to see that. And I think in one of my paintings called The Night Market, which was where I flipped like the people who were selling the things were animals. And the person that was on the slab being chopped up was a woman. And a lot of people, when they saw it, they thought, oh, kudos to you. Like, this is a vegetarian activist kind of thing. But to me, it was interesting to see their point of view because, there's never right or wrong about things. But it came from a perspective where I was just telling, in a weird way, what I saw at the market early in the morning when, the sun hasn't risen, everyone's sleeping. And I told it in a way that was just not usual, where I flipped the characters and it's no longer the pig that's being butchered, it's the person. But I think always in my work, I try to not put in gore, like don't bring in the blood, which I don't really like. I like to bring in the darkness, but I don't like to bring in blood. I try to not do that. And then sometimes I would, when you're painting, you listen to podcasts or stories or just movies, and sometimes I would listen to social issues, and there was this news about this Taiwanese author that had written a book, and the book was about this story. It was fiction, and it talked about a girl that was kind of raped by her tutor, and then that kind of rape became like if somebody rapes you but then tells you it's okay, I love you, that rape kind of becomes developed into a relationship that she was just kind of, I don't know. She's horrified by the rape, but then she believes it develops into a relationship. And then later to realize it wasn't true. And then she wrote the story. And then a few days later, she committed suicide. Oh, wow. And that was like a shocking story because it became, the police got into an investigation, but the conclusion was you couldn't do anything about it because it was a fictional story. There were even though she had, written diaries and notes, the person was not convicted. And he just kind of, nothing was done to him. And that story felt like really harrowing to me. And I was just like, I can't imagine. And that book was written in Mandarin. And my Mandarin is poor, even though I come from a Mandarin-speaking family. But I borrowed it from a friend and I read it. And it was hard reading it in Mandarin and also trying to listen to the story. And I ended up painting this story that I felt was disturbing to me. And so, yeah, I ended up using the story to make a painting. And sometimes I enjoy it because I feel like it's telling, an unjust story just in a quiet manner.
Right. And I guess that makes me wonder, like, the inner storyteller within you, kind of having that come out and allowing yourself to tell stories is one aspect of it, but what I guess attracts you to the darker stories? Is there, do you enjoy, is that just the kind of stories that you enjoy yourself, and so that's what you kind of want to tell? Or
I do love horror stories. When I was a kid, my dad had no notion of PG or rated stuff. It's like, you watch whatever I'm showing you. So I actually got to watch It, the movie.
Nice.
At a very young age. It was awesome. I loved it. I watched it with my dad. He switched off all the lights. I watched it. It was terrifying, but I loved it. And then there's also the Asian culture of vampire movies made in Hong Kong and those in that time. And I watched every one of it. It was terrifying at that time. It would give me scary nightmares. I even imagined at one point that there was a vampire in the closet for a long time. I wouldn't go into that room, but I still love horror stories. And I think because I loved it so much, I think I don't know, somehow it just kind of creeps out onto the canvas. And I do sometimes receive comments like, why your work so dark? Are you okay? Is there something wrong with you? And I think a few years ago, it got to me. I don't know if things ever, like if somebody says, you're quite an inferior person. And if they keep repeatedly, do that to you, does it affect you in some ways?
You start to believe it. I mean, right? You start to think maybe there's something there,
Yeah. And then I start to feel like, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me. Am I too pessimistic? Should I start to paint something happier? And then I just felt like it got to me in a bad way. It made me depressed. And then it got to me later on in anger. I think that depression kind of changed and transitioned to anger. And there's feeling like, wait a minute, that's not how it came about. Like that butcher, that whole like night market scene where a woman is being butchered up. It didn't come from an angle of like violence. It came from an angle of, oh, I woke up at 5 a.m. and with my dad to set up business. And I got to see this other side of the market in operation as a kid. And I think that's how I approach my work. I don't approach it with like, look at this anger or look at this violence. I don't do that.
And like you said earlier, you tend to you don't want to have blood and a lot of the gore aspects of it. It's more, just the feeling of the moment rather than like forcing people to look at the horror.
Right. I mean, some of the works are, I guess you could look at it and feel like it's haunting. I would use the word haunting, but I wouldn't use like gore or violence in my work. Yeah.
And I think that tends to make, at least to me, make it feel a bit more like psychological almost, like almost like it's evoking uncovered or repressed memories in a way, like for the viewers as they look through it, they kind of evoke that sense of a memory that maybe they only dreamed about or that's repressed in some way. I guess, is there a larger message that you're trying to tell across all of your works, or are these sort of self-contained kind of vignettes?
I think sometimes there is a shout out about something. Like if I come across some social issue that really bothered me, and then I would try to put it in. Like when the whole, like, I don't really like to talk about it, but like the Me Too movement. And then you start feeling like, you want to do something. I don't think I'm the kind of person that really goes onto social media and, shout out like things in a loud way. It's just not who I am. And I have a lot of respect for people who can't do that. I just feel like I'm poor at it. I don't know how to do that without feeling judged, so to speak. Like I'm always worried about being judged. So sometimes I end up not really saying too much, but when I can, like in the story of that whole Taiwan author, finding your own quiet way to speak up for somebody, I think is a way that I shout out. Not in words, because I'm no good at words. With words, I'm just poor, but with pictures, I try to do that. And then sometimes it's portraying a side of me, like either to remember what it used to be like at that moment in my time, or putting it down on canvas or paper and showing somebody who cares to look at it like, oh, this is a little sliver of me. Do you understand? Like that.
Does it matter to you much if the person that's viewing your work understands the story in the way that you're trying to tell it? Like understands that, hey, this is about me, or this is this kind of other story that I'm kind of recontextualizing? Or is it just about getting it out of you, and how people interpret it doesn't matter as much?
I think at the beginning you do worry about what people will say about your work. Like if you're trying to say something and if you're trying to show something that's haunting, but then they depict it like, do you have depression? Is there something wrong with you? Then that bothers me. So I try to not pay attention or not focus in that perspective, and just work on something that I feel that would make me happy. And then just putting it out there. And if somebody enjoyed it and it made them feel a different way, in a good way, then I think that's fine with me. But if it bothers them in a bad way, then I might end up just telling them, well, are you depressed? Is there something wrong with you?
Right.
Yeah, because sometimes it didn't come out that way when I first painted. And then someone that I know might say, oh, this is really sad. This painting is so sad. And to me, it's like, I didn't paint it that way. It's actually it's, sharing a moment. So then I was just telling them, I ended up replying like, are you sad? Is there something wrong?
Right. It's like a different version of like a Rorschach test. Like they're looking at your work and interpreting their own feelings through your work, and reflecting kind of, or projecting, I guess.
It actually gave me an opportunity to see where they are in their life. Like, are they actually sad? Is there something missing in their life right now to make them feel this way about my painting, which I did not paint it that way, the way that they're talking about. So yeah, if it was a friend looking at my work saying that, then it gives me an opportunity to understand that maybe there's something that I need to pay closer attention to them. Maybe it's like a little cry for help. Sometimes you never know. So
how do you, I guess, avoid letting people on social media or comments, influence? Because you kind of shared a story about how people were saying, are you okay? And that it got to you over time. How do you avoid letting that happen in the future to where it doesn't impact your work or the direction that you want to go?
So to be fair, I think people on social media don't really do that too much. It's very rare. This tendency comes from family and friends, which hits you even harder. Because you'll be like at a family gathering and somebody says, oh, you've gone to the dark side. And then you start to judge yourself. I don't know if you're like familiar with the story of Dorian Gray.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm kind of there too. There's this like, when I think about Dorian Gray, I think about this, think with the things that I paint. It's like, I think I'm a very private person. I try to not talk too much about myself, which is ironic since I'm doing this podcast. But yeah, sometimes when I paint, I feel like it's like Dorian Gray. The more I paint, the more I reveal who I am on canvas, on social media, everywhere for anybody to see. Then they're free to judge who I am. Some of them might be right. Some of them might even see the depression that I have that I don't even know. And it's scary because it becomes like this mirror into who it is that's painting. And I'm not trying to really show the world who I am. I think there's this part of me that is private enough that I don't want anybody to know what goes on behind the doors. But you can't really help it when you're telling stories through this canvas. Like, you become so vulnerable. So I think I still struggle with that. That's what painting, the fear of painting, this is what it is for me. Yeah.
Like revealing too much of yourself?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. Like,
interesting.
When you're behind closed doors, you don't play social media, nobody knows anything about you. The moment you do something, whether or not you create with design or you write a story, even, I don't know how many people have thought about Neil Gaiman. Is he depressed? Is he okay? He's writing horrific stuff. But I don't think of Neil Gaiman that way. I just think of him like, this is something he's interested in. He can spin his words and write them so creatively and beautifully. It's like magical. And it brings me to another world that I don't get to see. And he's painting it all for me in words, that this is so awesome. But then you get some people that would not like this genre and would just go ahead and attack the person that's doing the work instead of just admitting that they don't like a particular genre. I think that bothers me. It's like, if you don't like it, then you can leave. You don't have to, you don't have to attack the person and say like, oh, you're so and so, you're this again. Like it starts making me feel like, well, is it okay to be who I am then? If I am depressed, is it okay? If I'm happy, is it okay? Like, why does it matter? in that sense.
Yeah, it's hard to not let, as social as these platforms have become, it's hard to not let that get to you over time.
Yeah. So I kind of stopped playing so much in social media. I think the past few years, when it started, everybody was in it. Everybody is still in it. I'm still in it. And I would be like always scrolling, liking, checking out stuff, and then figuring out how you can get more people to follow you, like you.
Right.
And then you almost feel like, oh, you have to do everything that people are doing. You gotta show awesome videos. You gotta do everything. And then I just feel like, that's just not me. I get more stressed up trying to follow the formula. And I think I did get, depressed because of that. I think it really got to me when you try to do all the things that are just not you.
Yeah.
Like even going to gallery shows and socializing. Like, I don't want to socialize. I just want to go to art shows and enjoy all the pieces that I see. But then you'll see people and then you end up needing to talk to people because everyone's friendly. But at the same time, it terrifies me. Like, I never want to show up to my art openings. I don't like it. It scares me when people come up and they ask you about your work.
Vulnerable,
or they,
right?
Yeah. I think half the time people are asking me questions, my mind is actually blank. My armpits are sweating. Like they're sweating right now. So, yeah. I don't like the socializing part of life.
Yeah, I can totally relate. I mean, social anxiety and introversion, I think, is something that I'm quite familiar with too. So.
You too?
Oh yeah. I mean,
but you're doing podcasts.
It may not be obvious, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of masking going on.
So, what do you do when you're not doing podcasts from Mondays to Fridays? What is your normal?
I'm a software engineer. I work in development,
okay.
So very different than what I do as far as podcasting goes.
So my better half is also doing software engineering, so I can kind of understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
So back to you.
Okay.
How do you usually arrive at your ideas for like a new piece? Do you have like a daily sketch routine? Do you have other brainstorming activities? How do you usually come to your ideas?
Actually through photography. I just go around, and sometimes if something is interesting, I snap it and then I just kind of chuck it in a folder. And then when I need to do a work, I either think of a story or I just flip through my folder and look at the whole record of what I've put in and just find something that I think now is the right time to showcase it. So sometimes people think it's the story that brings about a creation, but very often it's actually, I want to showcase that landscape. Sometimes I think of myself like a landscape painter, not like the old traditional kind, but I just feel like going out on a walk, I see a window that's lighted up and I just want to paint it. There's no character in it. It's just a window lighted up. Sometimes though, you have to kind of think of a story and spin it into this thing that you want to paint, because then nobody would find it interesting enough to want to buy it. You still kind of need to have some income there, and that's how I do things sometimes.
So for the photo, do you use photo reference a lot, and is it your own photos that you use for reference?
Yeah, own photos when it comes to background, and then when you try to put in the characters, you might need to do some stock imaging, referencing, and then I think the training from my design company helped a lot because we did a lot of Photoshop, and then you're always trying to piece things together. There was a lot of Getty images back in designing. So I think that taught me to do comping, and I'm really grateful for that experience, which I bring it into my work these days. But I think the challenge is when the world has no more computers and you don't have any more Photoshop, what do artists do? Because I think I fall into the group where nowadays everyone's using Photoshop for painting. It's convenient, it's easy. What happens if you don't have it? I think I can still paint, but I think that piece that I paint would look different. I sometimes think about it that way. Like, so I think maybe one day I might challenge myself and say, let's shut off my computer. Let's, what are you going to do? What will happen?
Right.
Yeah. I haven't challenged myself yet, but it's a thought process that I think would be interesting.
Do you think it would impact your like composition, or just the entire piece as a whole would go in a different direction?
I think composition, I wouldn't be worried about it. I think it's the way you paint. It's no more in sharp focus. When it's Photoshop and you want to look at details, you can really zoom in at your own convenience. But if you're doing like still life, or you're out there painting a real scene, you don't get to do that. You don't go like whoop whoop, and then you get zoom in into the pixels. So I think things might get will shift in focus. It's not going to be as sharp. And maybe it'll help me because I've always wanted to be looser the way I paint. And maybe it's because I have painted with the help of Photoshop for so many years. I keep challenging myself, like, how can I be straighter? How can I be more detailed? That it will be interesting to see if one day when I'm all done with that, like, how can I not be in sharp details anymore? How do I move away from that? Yeah. So I haven't come to that point yet.
So at your current, like, way in which you work, once you start painting, do you have everything pretty locked down, or is there still, does it evolve further as you paint it?
I used to do a lot of sketching in books. I don't really do that anymore. I think when I have an idea, I kind of form it in my head, and then I look through images and try to see which one's going to fit with that background that I want to paint. And then from there, you go into comping with Photoshop and you test it out. So when I eventually paint, I already have an image ready for me to look at for referencing. Okay. So I think I would like to get out of that practice at some point in my life, just to see how it would mess with me.
And as far as your studio practice goes, I've read that you, at least at one point, I don't know if this is still the case, log your time in the studio. Is that something that you've always done? And I guess, what do you perceive the benefits of that being?
It started because often when I went to shows, people would ask me, how long did it take that painting to make? And I would never be able to tell them. So I talked to my better half, who knows more about tech stuff. And he said, why don't you try things like Toggle? So that I downloaded Toggle and I started punching in, punching out. And it showed me how fast or how slow I am. And then maybe it's an added stress. Maybe it's an aid to help you measure how much you're actually working, or asking yourself, did I really need to devote so much time in this piece? I don't know. I think that it helps that way.
Okay. And, obviously, as you talked about earlier, your primary medium is oil, but I also see some works listed as acrylic also, like oil and acrylic. So how do you use both in the same painting? How do you use acrylic when you're mostly working in oil?
I started with just purely oil. And then I went to a show and I saw somebody had labeled under their painting acrylic and oil. And I asked myself, how did they do that? So then I Googled it, and some people would apply layers of acrylic and then go in with oil. And I thought, okay, I'll try it out. And I started doing that, and it was fun because I don't usually work with acrylic. So it gave me a chance to practice on a different medium. And acrylic dries up a lot faster. But also, the annoying part for me with acrylics is once it dries up, it turns into a different shade of color, which was what I see when it's wet. I don't know if it's the same for people who use acrylics, but I felt like I had that problem. But the initial application of acrylics helped me to be faster. I think I was with downloading Toggle, trying to track my time, I was trying to speed up the way I paint. So I went with acrylics just as an experiment, and then finally coming on with oils, because you can't do it the other way around. Your acrylic would peel. So I would apply oil and for a while I did that. And then after that experiment, I just felt like it helped, but it didn't really help too much. So I kind of went back to oil and just exclusively oil for now.
Okay. And you also do graphite pieces as well that you've released with your paintings over the years. Are those usually just drawings that are ultimately in service of the eventual painting, like a study? Mm-hmm. Or do you have cases where graphite is the final destination and that's the ultimate goal?
There were sometimes I do drawings just to see how I would like it. Like once I finish it, do I still like it? And then I think after I finish it, if I really, really like it, I might end up doing a painting. Not usually like immediately after I finish the graphite. There are some paintings that I did maybe a few years ago, which I'm starting to do a painting of. Now that I understand that, oh, okay, I still like it. So it took me I did it in 2017. Now looking backwards, I like it enough. Can I apply it in color? And then it becomes like a painting. And then what can I throw into this piece that will make it more exciting to people?
Okay. Are there mediums that you'd like to explore someday that you haven't had the opportunity to?
I think actually something that's more organic using hands. I think I dabbled a little bit with paper mache in 2017 with my solo at Think Space, and I built some weird stuff. I built this giant teapot that was made with paper mache, and then I built really huge, gigantic tentacles with fabric. And then I think that whole installation, so this is installation art, and there was paper mache, there was fabric, there was buttons, and I was trying to create this seascape with a half submerged teacup, and then with lots of tentacles kind of coming out from the teacup. And then it was just, raining buttons. And that whole floor was just covered up in tons and tons of buttons. So that whole process, I kind of sketched it in my head. And then after that, I got you have it in 2D, and now how do you create it into 3D? What materials are you going to use, and how do you use it? How do you combine these different materials, and what happens if you run into a problem? Like with the buttons, I was trying to make it rain. But once you put buttons on a string, it's not, it's not going to stay there. How do you keep it from falling down? And if I were to tie each button on the string individually and I have to reproduce 200 strands, I would probably die, knotting it. So then, it's brainstorming with somebody that's interested. So Dave, my better half, is interested in things like that. He likes installation art, but he doesn't do it. So brainstorming with him is fun. You get to, have a little discussion with somebody that doesn't do art on a regular basis, and they throw out ideas. So he would tell me maybe we could try out this tension on the string. So if you were to, kind of loop, kind of strand it in a way, you would be able to use tension, and then each button would not fall, provided you use heavy buttons. I can't remember what he said, but it was this whole challenge of brainstorming, which you don't really get so much with painting, because you're familiar with how you paint the oils, what medium to use. The challenge comes when you're trying to paint something that you don't usually paint, or if you try to paint it in a different way, trying to paint the Bob Ross way, for example. That is really mind-blowing. You watch him, it's so easy, and then I say to myself, let's try to do the Bob Ross way. And I end up using a fine tip brush, which was just defeated the purpose, to create little leaves. He was using big bristles, and I was using a tiny pointed, I failed that experiment. But with installation art, it's you're being presented with a different idea, 3D, and what materials can you use that's going to work with what you sketched out in your head. So, and then you get to do little small mock-ups, which is almost like comping on Photoshop, but you're doing it live in 3D. It's almost like doing studies of paintings in graphite, but you're making, small little clay models. So I was playing with plasticine and trying to mold it, and then doing like floor plans of think space, the room, like how big do I need this teacup to be, and how many buttons do I need, and then actually getting the material was another challenge. Like, where are you gonna get millions of buttons? So going online to find buttons, like, wow, that's really expensive. I don't have that money. Where am I going to get it? And then I went into a fabric store. They had a huge crate filled with buttons. I said, how much would you get rid of this? Like, how much would you offer? And they said something like 200 or somewhere close to 300. And I said, I'll take it.
The whole crate?
The whole crate. And there was like, when I said it, somebody was like still fishing for what they wanted from that huge crate. And he looked up at me and he said, I can keep these, right? I said, yes, go ahead. Yeah. And then when the installation finished, I kept the buttons for a few years because it just felt like these are so hard to find and get, like, it was in storage for a few years, and then I eventually returned it to the same store for free. Yeah. So the whole process is fun and exciting to me. So that's something I would like to do if I wasn't painting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It sounds like just the problem solving aspect of it is what seems interesting to you.
Yeah. Like after you sew the skin of the tentacles, what do you stuff it with? So then I had to think about it. And then how do you get it to stick in the teacup, and how do you get it to hang to the ceiling without it tipping over? Like it dealt with physics, which I failed in school. So, it's interesting. It brings out math and physics and all sorts of different things that I wasn't good in, but then you kind of have to challenge yourself when you have to do something like that. So yeah, that is fun for me.
Very cool. So let's talk about your new show, opening at ThinkSpace on October 7th, which is the Saturday after this episode should debut. The show is titled Secret Garden. What can you tell me about this new body of work?
So I actually rehearsed this part.
Okay.
I tried to think about how I'm going to tell you. And several times when I tried to tell Dave, I failed. And it got me really, really stressed up. So I'm going to try again my best. And if it doesn't work, I'm sorry.
It'll be great.
Yeah, okay. Sure. So I would kind of summarize it as a capture of a fleeting moment, a quiet moment. If you ask me where the inspiration came from, it came from this movie made in 1992. It's by actress Juliette Lewis. The title of the movie was called That Night. I watched this when I was a little girl in Singapore. There wasn't a lot of movies to watch, There was no such thing as Roku or Netflix. So you get whatever cable gives you. And I watched it, and there was this scene of Juliette Lewis in her room late at night, and she was topless. She had a bra on. She had her record playing. There was nobody in her room. She was young. She was in her room all by herself. She had a fan blowing at her hair. Her hair was just blowing, and then she sprayed perfume at her neck. And that whole scene of her in the bedroom was witnessed by this 10-year-old across the street from her window. So she's looking at Juliette Lewis in her room through her window. And that scene captivated me for many years till now. I still think about it. It's you see her spraying the perfume. It's a movie. It's 2D, obviously, but you can almost smell it. You can smell that perfume. You can see it, but, that whole feeling of watching somebody secretly from your window and seeing something that captivated me. And I think sometimes when I'm walking down the street late at night, especially late at night when everything is dark, the lights are on, and you walk past and you see this window and you wonder what's inside? What's going on in there? And I think as a kid, I would sometimes I had this binoculars. So I'll wait till late at night, everyone's sleeping, and I would take out my binoculars. It sounds real creepy now, but I was a kid. I was a really young kid, and I was nobody paid attention to me. I was the only child. The adults have their own things to do. That's what I did. And sometimes I would peep into windows and see interesting, nothing sexual, but it was like, what people are watching on TV. Sometimes it would even scare me. Like I would be looking at a window and there's this silhouette, but it almost looks like a mop with a body. It almost looks like a woman's silhouette that's like still and just staring back at you. And I would be like, is that a person? Is that just a silhouette of a mop, like placed upright? Like I would end up scaring myself, and I would be like, oh no, shit, like I can't look at this anymore. So it's interesting what you can see through this window. It frames an image for you. So I think the inspiration comes from that movie, the whole feeling of how a window can frame something and it draws you in, but it can also draw you out. And I started with that. And then it kind of developed into this, a window and catching a moment of how you can just be quiet. And by quiet, I don't mean like absolute silence, but a quietness of this like serenity in your head where you can just be on your own. The world could be moving. There could be somebody walking next to you, but you're in your head, in your own space. You're comfortable. Maybe you're uncomfortable. Nobody knows, but you're in your own isolated space thinking about whatever you want. And I wanted to capture that feeling. And I think there was also this, when I think about this time when I was on a bus in Singapore and the bus had hit like a traffic light. We're stopping and pedestrians were crossing and everyone was just so busy, walking up and down, going wherever they wanted to go. And there was just this woman standing. She's obviously maybe a little bit mentally disabled, but she was there. She was standing in the midst of that traffic light where it was chaotic and fast, but she was just there standing on her own and she was just smiling. I think maybe to most people seeing that would be like, oh, creepy, But to me, it felt like I want to know what she's thinking.
Right.
That made her smile so much. Like, why is it that everybody is so busy? Everybody is so bothered by whatever is occupying in their head. They're so pressed with time, but she's just there in her own head, enjoying that moment of whatever moment it is. I want to know what it is. And I think that also kind of crept in my head and never left. And I think that's kind of what this solo is about, just capturing a quiet moment where you can be on your own, wherever you are.
Interesting. So, that theme that you've been inspired by, is that something that you sort of developed first and then created all of the pieces with that kind of idea in mind? Or did you just start working and then that just naturally kind of developed as the theme?
I think it was a feeling I had that started this whole collection. It started with this song that was, I think, in Chinese. It was something about summer breeze. And this guy is singing about summertime, the breeze, your hair that blows in the breeze, and I can smell that fragrance from your hair. I think the lyrics kind of stuck to my head and I wanted to lock that feeling. And then it kind of rethinking about the 1992 movie that night. And then all of those little components coming by to kind of like gather up into this creation, I think was how I felt about it. And then it just went there.
So as you were creating the pieces, you kept reflecting on those feelings and going back to it?
Yeah. And then I think it was also done in a time where COVID happened, the whole pandemic. So you're kind of like stuck. But I didn't really feel stuck because as a painter, I'm always at home. Right. It didn't really feel any different to me. But But I think, everything was being remote. People who worked in offices were starting to do remote stuff. And then a lot of places that you can't go anymore. There's almost this quiet serenity. And then, so many examples of people coming on shows or when you meet them talking about how the pandemic gave them a time to reflect, be quiet. You're so used to time pressing you and pushing you along that when this pandemic happened, it stops you for just, a moment, and you rethink your life to some degree. So I think maybe that kind of pushed the collection in this way too.
So overall, when did you start, I guess, working on it? Was it pre-COVID, or was it like in the midst of the pandemic?
I think at the early beginning, like when I started hearing Singapore was starting to get COVID, like my family would call and say, buy toilet paper now. And I'll be like, right. Why? Like, I'm sure it's okay. Like, you guys are exaggerating. So right at that moment, I was already starting my first piece. And then from LA, I actually moved and relocated to Providence. So it's been several years, I guess, 3 years of building up this collection. It's been a while.
Awesome. Is there a particular piece in the show that, maybe challenged you more than some of the others?
I think it's the main piece, Secret Garden, where you have like a lot of trees, the background is dark, and there's this girl in full white that's trying to enter into this dark space.
With the blue ribbon. I love that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I almost titled it Ghost, but I felt like maybe someone's going to give me a hard time with that title and ask me, are you okay? What's wrong with you? Like, okay, I'll choose something better, more whimsical. But yeah, I always tell myself, stop painting leaves. Like, stop giving yourself a hard time. Like, don't paint something so intricate. It's going to take up so much time and effort. And then you're going to feel like at 3/4 of that process, like, I want to give up. But I always end up doing something that I told myself not to do. But then the whole I challenged the whole idea of Bob Ross like several years ago when I made something for another solo with Think Space in 2017. And that experiment failed. But what can I learn from it? How can I quicken myself and get closer to the Bob Ross technique? So the Secret Garden had a lot of leaves. And what I failed from before, I tried to, recover here. I'm nowhere near Bob Ross. Like, he's too fast. But yeah, this Secret Garden was a challenge to, ask myself, how can I be faster? If I was slow before tackling leaves, can I be faster? And there was actually some elements of that picture that I took that I didn't want. So I had to remove and then, kind of like patching it up. Like, how can I make it in such a way that it's not obvious that some of the elements are gone? Like, you won't be able to tell because you've
right.
never seen the actual photo.
Yeah. Awesome. I have to imagine that the piece I think is called Windflowers was also difficult just because of all the sheer, like the pattern on the sheer curtain between the viewer and the open or the window. Right. That had to have been, I can't even imagine how you got that like aesthetic of the sheer curtain.
Right. I know that piece was going to be hard, but I know I could do it. The challenge was actually, I think the colors, the skin tone of the girl. Like, maybe it was from where she was inside the room, like in that window frame, like she's looking out of the window and worrying about if the skin tone color on her is right. And yeah, I didn't really have troubles with the lace texture. Yeah, it took a while, I admit, but
sure.
Yeah.
So how many pieces will there be overall? Is it the 9 paintings, or will you also have graphite drawings, some other things as well?
Yeah, there'll be like 4 more graphite drawings. It's a smaller collection, so that's what I'm aiming for. No art installation this time.
Okay.
I used to think I would, keep doing art installation, but I think moving away from LA, like that created another distance problem. Like, I don't think I'll be able to make an installation art for this solo this time around, unfortunately. But maybe someday. Maybe someday.
Will you be attending the opening?
No. Which
Okay.
I think maybe ThinkSpace would say, oh, I wish you're there. And I think a part of me would say, yeah, I wish I was there to see the actual, like, works being there, the actual people being there. But then another part of me would be like, yay, I can't be there.
Yeah, we just talked about, like, that's not a super comfortable experience, I'm
Right.
sure.
Yeah, because often a lot of people don't know, but at the end of the opening, I don't know if that happens to the people who work at galleries, but I'm drained.
Sure.
Like I literally feel like how you feel when you haven't slept in 2 days.
Because you have to be on for that whole period,
Right.
Like, everybody's coming to talk to you, and you have to be the center of attention. Like, that's hard.
Right, which I don't like. I don't like being in the, yeah. So I think if they installed like a little private camera where I could see like live what's going on, that would be great, but I don't want to put that on them. Yeah.
Anything else coming up that you'd want to put on people's radars? Any events, print releases, stuff like that?
Well, there's I have two group exhibitions coming up in Australia. So Australia is a new place that I'm working with that started recently these years with Beanart and Outre Gallery. I hope I pronounced them correctly. Working with a different region is interesting and exciting. It's coming up in September, but I'm not sure if the podcast will be released before then. But I also have another solo coming up next year.
Okay. Do you already know where that is? That going to be with ThinkSpace as well, or was it? With
That's going to be with Beanart.
Okay.
Yeah, next year
Awesome.
In Australia. So something different that I've never done before. So maybe I'll end up going to Australia just for a little vacation. Well, I don't know. Yeah, we'll see.
Have you been to Australia before?
I have not, but I've heard a lot about it. After I kind of quit high school, I did a few jobs here and there, and then for a while I was actually working I sold air tickets, believe it or not. Okay. Back in the days where you can't buy your own tickets and you have to go to a company to buy it. I was working at such company. It was a timeshare company, but they also had a department where they sold air tickets. So okay.
Like a travel agent, I guess.
Yeah, a travel agency kind of, yeah. So I was in the travel department and I kind of needed to brush up on the places, and I did a lot of reading up on Australia. So yeah, but there was a lot of touristy stuff that I wanted to go then, like, the bee honey factory, things like that. So there's some, things about Australia that seems familiar because of that. But I don't know how much it's changed and what I want to do these days if I do go there.
Yeah. Well, you might have an opportunity to check it out, I guess, next year. So maybe. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online so they can stay up to date with all these new things you got going on?
Well, Instagram. I'm on Instagram if anybody is looking on Instagram. Largely Instagram and I guess just website. But, yep.
All right. Last question, and this is something that I like to ask everybody. Who is one artist that you'd like to see me have on the show?
Have you had, I'm not sure, I think you have not, but have you had a podcast with, I hope I pronounce her name right, Femke Heimstra?
No.
Yeah,
I haven't had her yet.
Yeah. So I think you've had Esau, so I can't say Esau anymore. And Femke Heimstra, I like her work, or Peter Ferguson.
Okay.
Yeah. So
awesome.
Or Sam Wolf Connelly. Oh, I'm listing out too many. Yeah.
Sam Wolf Connelly. Yeah, Sam's cool. I've met him, but I've not done a show with him. So I met him at like a MondoCon in Austin. So I live in Austin, and they had a convention here that he attended one year. So I met him.
Yeah, I checked out his work. I think he had some like tutorials on YouTube, and some of his works are like largely graphite, and the way he executes his work is like it's different. So for us, it's like layers after layers of graphite. His is more like lifting off graphite, which is a technique that I don't use unless I need to create highlights. So it's really interesting to see how he works. So it's totally different, and I like to see artists who does things different that I can't do. So
Yeah. Awesome. Well, great choices. I really appreciate it. Jolene, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm glad I survived it. I hope I didn't.
You did amazing.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of Art Affairs. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jolene. It was interesting to talk with Jolene about the impact that other people's words about you can have over time, and especially the people that are closest to you, and how they can have an impact on your own self-worth and self-image. And on the flip side, it was also interesting to talk about the strength that it requires to not let that get to you, to possibly get to the point where you look at it as an opportunity to check in on the person, your friend, your family member, whomever, as they might actually be projecting their own feelings on you. That can be really hard, and it's difficult to not let that sort of thing chip away at your own self-confidence. It seems like Jolene is in a much better place with that now. Her new solo show looks great. Titled Secret Garden, it opens at ThinkSpace on October 7th, the Saturday after this episode should debut. She sent me a preview of the painted works before we recorded, and it's a really strong body of work. I'm excited for you all to see it. I thought her description of the inspiration was really interesting. Sort of like this combination of, the quiet serenity of sitting and looking out a window, thoughtful and in your own head, coupled with this almost visceral feeling of, getting a glimpse into someone else's life and the curiosity that comes from that. If you're in the LA area, be sure to drop by on opening night and see everything up close. It sounds like she'll have some graphite works in addition to the paintings that we talked about. Also follow her Instagram to stay up to date with the other shows she has coming up in Australia. So thanks again to Jolene for joining me today, and thank you for checking out the show. I'm truly grateful for your support. And just a reminder, one big way you could help out if you're really enjoying the show would be to check out the show's Patreon. You can find all the details on patreon.com/artaffairs. And as always, you can contact me through my website at artaffairs.podcast.com or on Instagram at artaffairs.podcast. So until next time, be good to yourself and be good to each other.